My name is Nate Mickle. You're listening to Mickles and Dimes Layer 2, where every interview is dedicated to the simple, the practical, and the underappreciated. Ingrid Price, Special Counsel for Covington Burling, advises clients on national security matters, including cross-border investment, supply chain security, and public policy. She has successfully represented numerous clients in gaining regulatory approval across various technology sectors, including AI, mobile applications, software, telecommunications, and robotics. Prior to joining Covington, Ingrid clerked for Chief Judge James E. Baker of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Services. She also served as in-house counsel at Amazon Web Services before returning to Covington as special counsel. Ingrid is a graduate of Stanford Law School and the University of Cambridge. I hope you enjoy learning from Ingrid Price today. Ingrid, it's so great to connect today. It's been a while, and you've had such an interesting career since we graduated law school, so I look forward to learning about what you're doing and how you got into what you're doing.
Yeah, no, it's great to see you too and talk to you, Nate. Just by quick way of background, I always had an interest in sort of national security and international law. And even through law school, I tried to sort of seek out opportunities to focus on those areas in law school. And then following law school, I thought perhaps I would end up going into the public sector. That's where a lot of the international law and national security related work is. But come to find out, there's actually a significant amount of work you can also do in the private sector that focuses on that area. And where I sort of ultimately ended up was working, becoming an expert on particularly inbound investment issues in the US. So the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States is a regulatory body that reviews cross-border transactions for national security implications. And they have significant and broad authority to block transactions or mitigate transactions where they believe that they might pose a risk to U.S. national security. So it's been a really fun area of law to practice in. It's not sort of something I knew about going into law school, but I was able to take my general interest and then find an area of expertise where I could sort of specialize. So it's been really fun.
Yeah, so that's so interesting. So you did graduate school before law school, and remind me, Oxford, Cambridge.
Yeah, so I did an MPhil at the University of Cambridge in the UK, focused on international relations as well. And part of that was like I knew I wanted to go to law school, but I also had this sort of international relations interest. And so I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit more and develop it before I launched into law school.
So even though you weren't necessarily, when you were doing your graduate studies, you weren't necessarily thinking that that would lead you to the specific career that you're in now, it was laying some groundwork for your eventual career path.
Yeah, it's sort of there's sort of like this red thread through it all in the sense that like my MPhil thesis focused on international security and human security issues in Afghanistan. And so there was sort of even then like a national security component to the way that I was, thinking about and studying these areas. But what I did not know about at the time was sort of, there's actually this like very robust regulatory practice of law in the United States that is also national security focused. And that also has like this sort of policy component to it. So I get to keep thinking about those issues and engaging on those like while in the practice of law, which has been really fun.
Okay, so let's dig in a little bit to kind of what you do on day to day and what sort of regulations you're dealing with and advising companies on.
Yeah, so my main area of focus, as I mentioned, is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. It's a multi-agency regulatory body or committee that reviews inbound investment in the United States, certain transactions where there could be foreign control of a U.S. business, or in certain other circumstances, there's jurisdiction as well. And we essentially advise clients from the very beginning of like a deal all the way through the CFIUS process and post CFIUS process. So we will advise companies on whether or not their transaction could be subject to CFIUS jurisdiction. That can happen even if you have sort of an ex-US transaction. So you have, a French headquartered company acquiring a UK company. If that UK company has a US subsidiary, it's sort of, there's various tests but certain nexus to the United States, then there could still be jurisdiction for this regulatory review to be triggered. So we advise clients sort of on that part. We advise them on the risks, the CFIUS risks, the risk that CFIUS is going to identify certain issues with the transaction. And then, we guide them through the actual regulatory review process. Oftentimes for more complex transactions or where we do expect there could be issues, CFIUS will require something called a national security agreement, which is an agreement with the government to mitigate those risks. And then following, if a transaction clears, which it does most of the time, but often that's with mitigation, and some, more often it's not with mitigation, but then frequently we're seeing there's also mitigation. Then companies have this new sort of compliance burden that they have post-closing, where they have to implement these mitigation requirements by the U.S. government. And it's a committee with significantly broad authority because of the nexus to U.S. national security. That's where the U.S. government is operating at its sort of like greatest discretion and deference. And so it's very interesting to see sort of, and it can be hard for parties at times because they're dealing with sort of on their counterparts on the government side when reviewing these transactions are relying on classified information that's never going to be shared with the parties, significant sort of national security. The intelligence community has a role in it. And a lot of that, parties are never actually privy to in connection with the review. So we sort of have to help them their hand and guide them through the process, recognizing that they're kind of negotiating with their hands tied behind their back.
This is Nate here with a quick interjection. I next asked Ingrid about a specific company, but I have edited the reference just for the sake of confidentiality, given that Ingrid can't comment on specific companies.
So I can't speak to sort of any specific company scenarios, just given that I'm employed at a firm. But I think more generally, if you take a step back, I think every sort of foreign company that's looking to acquire an interest in a U.S. company where there could be any nexus to U.S. national security. And if you look at the CFIUS regulations, sensitive personal data, material non-public technical information, which is like sort of certain export control technology, as well as like critical infrastructure, sort of three areas that are actually named specifically in the regulations as areas that if a U.S. company is engaged in those activities, there's probably going to be certain sensitivities that CFIUS is going to want to review, particularly depending on who the acquirer is. And then in addition to that, President Biden issued an executive order a couple of years ago now, or about a year and a half ago, that sort of further detailed what CFIUS should be looking at when reviewing transactions. And that has to do with like advanced technology. If you're involved in AI, quantum computing, that kind of work, if you're collecting significant volumes of US personal data, which, like a number of tech related companies are doing, depending on what it is, like the applications they're developing, and then I think more generally too, it's true that just like CFIUS follows, as I said, it's very much informed by like the geopolitical climate. So as relations with China have deteriorated, so has it become increasingly difficult for any sort of Chinese party to successfully clear CFIUS, which means that you might not see as much like investment coming from China into these various companies that would otherwise be subject to a CFIUS review.
This is Nate here with my final interjection. I asked Ingrid about another specific company, but again have edited the reference for the sake of confidentiality. I guess I'm wondering is if a company wants to operate in the U.S., not doing inbound investment per se, but just wants to operate in the U.S., does that also trigger CFIUS?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So like, again, speaking generally, CFIUS covers, its jurisdiction is focused on certain types of transactions, usually like acquisitions of control or certain like non-passive, non-controlling investments. So if a company is taking like 8% in a board seat, but like the target has certain critical technology, that could still not only trigger CFIUS jurisdiction, there would actually be a mandatory filing there. So it's actually, it's very broad in one sense. On the other hand, like, no, like it doesn't cover, for example, like greenfield investment. But the US has been trying, I think, more broadly, they sort of recognized that there are gaps in the regulatory regime. And so there have been other efforts through executive orders in particular to sort of close certain gaps that they see where other national security issues come up. And this is also covered by our practice. But for example, right before there was a transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, I think it's like the day before the inauguration or something like that, President Trump signed an executive order that gave Commerce the authority to review and prohibit transactions involving ICTS, or information communications and technologies and services. And that would cover like commercial transactions between certain countries of concern and U.S. companies. So that could stretch well beyond just like an acquisition, for example, and like move into the space of, if your application, or if, like you're even sort of providing critical infrastructure in the US and you're incorporating some kind of like Chinese or Russian developed software, hardware, et cetera, into as a sort of component in your supply chain, that could raise national security issues. And all of a sudden, like the government now does have authority to sort of investigate and review that. And that is something that hasn't been exercised significantly, although Commerce did just like prohibit Kaspersky a few weeks ago, issued a final determination prohibiting, which is Russian, but Kaspersky antivirus software has, been prohibited across the board. And then similarly, the Department of Justice is just working now on a regulation regarding sensitive data. So where there's sort of any transaction between a US company and a country of concern, again, sort of like Russia, China, and that transaction could involve access to sort of significant volumes of certain personal data, then there may be prohibitions or restrictions around those transactions as well. So they're trying to sort of close gaps, because CFIUS does not have CFIUS has incredibly broad authority, but it's still limited.
And does this apply to outbound investments? So if a US person wants to buy something in China or Russia or a country of concern, is CFIUS also invoked?
That's a great question. So CFIUS does not cover outbound investment, but the Treasury Department just issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. So sort of like following this drumbeat, which outlines actually a proposed regulatory regime that would cover outbound investment. And I think this is the first like that any Western government has sort of like developed to this sort of level. And it's particularly focused on US outbound investment in China with respect to like areas of AI, quantum computing, supercomputers. It really, chips that get affected, like the development of integrated circuits, for example, is like a focus of the outbound regime. So it's sort of much more targeted and tailored to very specific technologies and areas of concern, whereas like I think CFIUS has much broader discretion vis-a-vis determining sort of what's national security and what could implicate it. But there is going to be an outbound investment regime very shortly here in the US. While targeted, it still could have significant implications for US business.
For the vast majority of us who don't engage in international business, it's easy to underappreciate what steps the U.S. government is taking to protect its interests. We understand, of course, that relationships are strained with some of these countries, but it's really interesting to hear about the mechanics of how the government protects its interests. Now, you said greenfield investments. Can you describe what a greenfield investment is?
Yeah, so for example, if there is no sort of US business yet, but like a Chinese company decides to expand into the US and they, develop from the ground up. So they're not acquiring sort of something that's an existing US business, but maybe they already owned a facility in the US and now they're going to sort of start up operations there and hire employees and things like that. That's not covered generally. There's still certain real estate transactions, like the acquisition of the facility could actually be covered depending on, whether it's close to various military sites and things like that. So there's some exceptions, but generally, as a general matter, those transactions are not caught up.
Okay. So 2 more questions. First, what do you most enjoy about your job?
Yeah, I really enjoy sort of the diverse client set. I mean, I get to learn about I knew a lot about national security coming into my job. And I think like that piece of it and thinking through like the issues that the US government would identify and things like that is sort of like a fun part of it, but also, I could build on my background. But I have to learn so much about every company, and they span all the various industries, right? From semiconductor to the energy sector to, application development to, like some are significant government contractors, we have aerospace. I mean, it's just sort of like runs like every industry. Sort of bioscience is a big one. And so it's been really fun to sort of have to like learn and become a little bit of an expert in all of these. And like each company is different and learning about them. So that's actually been a fun piece where I feel like I'm still learning so much,
Yeah.
even though I also get to sort of leverage like my interests and skills. So that's probably like one very fun component of what I enjoy.
Yeah, pretty cool because there's so many jobs you get to a point where you stop learning. And once you stop learning in your job, then
Yeah.
the job satisfaction just starts to tank. So really cool that you're and learning about these companies, learning about cutting edge technologies as well, which has got to be pretty cool. So, okay. And then last question, what have you learned from your work, your career that you would most want to pass on to others?
This is a good question. I mean, I think it's just that, like, I mean, I do feel like I am constantly learning, and what I have found greatest sort of satisfaction in my job is like when I'm constantly being challenged and sort of pushed to think about things, and um and like when we're presented with sort of like new or novel issues, like I think sort of continuing to be challenged and find that to be sort of the most satisfying part. I think to your point, if I ever got to a point where I just felt like it was plug and play the whole time, it would probably be time to find something new. But between sort of like the various clients that we, with so many different expectations we have to meet, combined with the ever evolving like geopolitical landscape, I don't think that there's any chance of getting bored anytime soon. I think the other piece that I would just say is that even from like the beginning, I think when I started out as an associate, I felt completely like underwater and overwhelmed and like I don't have any value add here.
Mhm.
But I think come to find out, you always like do have some value add, and I think one should come into sort of their career, confident that they do have something to contribute, but also, with the degree of like humility that like I also always have something to learn. So I think if you have this perspective, like I'm always still learning, but also I, have something to contribute here, like you can sort of, and I think there's a balance in those things to be sort of the most effective advocate, because I think there's a danger if you are, ever doubt yourself, but also, the danger in being overconfident. So I mean, like those are sort of trying to walk that line and be conscious that I do have something to contribute, but also still a lot to learn.
Well, that's so interesting too, given your academic background, because outside looking in, people would say, like, of course you have so much to contribute. You look at look at your academic pedigree. If nothing else, we can always bring energy, right? Certainly, you brought more than just energy to your career. Well, it's so great to talk to you. We spend so much time on the academic and the theoretical, and so it's always so interesting to talk to somebody who's out there doing it, dealing with real world issues that are protecting our national security. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast today, Ingrid.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to you. Thanks, Nate.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mickles and Dimes with Ingrid Price. What interesting work Ingrid does is she helps companies comply with national security law. When it comes to investment in technologies that are relevant to national security, such as AI, quantum computing, integrated circuits, or even collecting sensitive personal data, the U.S. government wants to ensure that its interests are protected. So it was interesting to hear how Ingrid helps companies navigate that investment process. And I thought it was especially interesting that Ingrid felt underwater and overwhelmed when she first started her career, especially given her intelligence and background. But her advice is excellent. People should come into their careers with confidence, knowing they have something to contribute, but also with humility, recognizing that there is always more to learn. It's a simple idea. Please take it seriously. Nate Mickle here with 2 quick requests. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a 5-star review on your favorite podcast player. Thanks for your support.